Hi, I'm Jim Luby, Professor of Horticultural Science at the University of Minnesota, and along with my colleague David Bedford, also pictured on this slide, we've been leading the University of Minnesota apple breeding program in developing new varieties. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we commercialize and name those new varieties. Now, apple breeding is an expensive and very risky research. Getting a new apple variety is indeed a rare event. Only about one tree out of 20,000 that we look at is actually commercialized and introduced as a new variety. And this requires about 20 to 30 years of research investment and at a cost of about $800,000 per variety. So we like to say it's a pretty rare event. It's a bit like looking for diamonds in the sand. And even when we do find one, there's still a lot of uncertainty about whether growers and consumers will like it, and then what is needed to bring it to market successfully. So apple commercialization, in addition to just developing varieties, is also a big job. We've got to cultivate commercial relationships with nurseries, growers, and marketers of apples. We've got to develop plants that are free of virus so we can have clean, healthy nursery stock and also potentially move plant material around the world. We also protect the intellectual property related to the varieties using plant patents, what are called plant breeders' rights, which are like plant patents in other countries, and trademarks, and we'll talk more about these later. And then we license nurseries and fruit growers to grow the varieties and monitor their compliance and any infringement that might occur. Now, let's look historically back at apple variety commercialization. Going back to the early stages of our University of Minnesota program, our first variety came out in 1920, and up until about 1991, when Honeycrisp was introduced, we found that University of Minnesota varieties were mainly grown regionally. Very few of them ever went out of the upper Midwest region. The quality of the fruit that was sold was monitored by local growers who did direct marketing, and the breeding of the varieties at the university was 100% funded by state and federal funds. So the commercialization model that was used at this point is what we call the free model. There was no intellectual property protection, no licensing, no cost to the user of growing the variety. Availability varied depending on which nurseries picked it up. There was also no return to University of Minnesota research investment, and there was no interest in fruit quality standards or whether there should be any limits to production. Now, several things changed as we got into the 1990s. Specifically, one thing that changed was funding of the research. Agricultural research received less funding as public spending priorities changed for the nation and for the state of Minnesota. And this resulted in funding cuts to the University of Minnesota apple breeding program that began in the 1980s recession, continued through the dot-com crash at the turn of the century, and then the Great Recession in 2009. And public funding now covers about 15% of the apple breeding cost, whereas back prior to 1980, it was about 100%. The other major thing that changed in 1980 was what was called the Bayh-Dole Act. This was an act of Congress that granted universities the rights to protect intellectual property that was developed as part of their research. So this is the way the university protects vaccines that are developed, pharmaceuticals, and even apple varieties. So these were a couple big changes that happened as we got into the turn of the century to the 2000s. And that led to newer commercialization models. So starting in 1991 with the introduction of Honeycrisp, we have what we call an open commercialization model, where the variety has a plant patent, and that allows the developer to control the propagation rights to that variety, usually by means of grafting in the case of apples. What the university has done then with these open commercialized varieties is non-exclusively license them to nurseries who then pay a royalty per tree that they sell. So this provides some limited return, at least, to University of Minnesota research investment. It can provide wide availability if multiple nurseries pick it up, although this depends on the variety. Again, anybody can grow the variety, so there are no fruit quality standards for fruit going into the market, and no management of production limits. So as we went from the 90s to the 20 teens again, some other things changed too. We had much greater interest in certain University of Minnesota varieties. Starting with Honeycrisp, we had national and global interest, for example, in that variety. We also entered into the era of branded varieties. Now, Pink Lady, which many of you probably know from shopping your supermarket, was introduced as the first branded and managed variety in the world. It was developed in Western Australia, and it rapidly gained market share in the early 2000s. It was followed by the variety Jazz, which you probably recognize, and many others to this day. Now, the other thing that changed along with this interest in new varieties and the potential to brand them and develop marketing programs around them were growers' willingness to invest in their marketing of high quality new varieties in return for the ability to manage production volume and quality and manage the marketing program. So some of the things we learned with Honeycrisp in the United States during this period is that some of our varieties can be of national interest, like Honeycrisp. The university has, once it introduced the variety under the open model, really has no influence on the quality of the fruit that's produced. And this became somewhat of a problem with Honeycrisp as it was planted and produced in climates that were not really favorable to good quality for that apple. And then also there was a minimal return to the University of Minnesota investment, only a tree royalty in the case of Honeycrisp, that did not provide an adequate return for what was done over the 30 years that it took to produce that new variety. So we came to the era of what are called managed varieties in 1995 with Honeycrisp in Europe and with the Sweet Tango program in the United States and Canada in 2006. And these were developed as managed variety commercialization plans. This involved the licensing of propagation and the trademark use rights to a specific party, and the specification of quality and incentives for production, and then milestones that that party had to attain as far as production. And in return, the university receives tree and fruit royalties, which provides a reliable revenue stream for future research. So this managed commercialization model, which has been used starting again with Honeycrisp overseas, where it is sold as Honey Crunch, started in 1995 and continues to the present with certain varieties. In this kind of a program, growers are required to invest in plantings at a certain level and to invest in the marketing of the new variety to make it successful, to, for example, provide tastings, marketing materials, advertising, and so forth that's needed to get visibility for a new variety. In return for this, they get exclusive licensing of the variety for a period of time. They have to meet fruit quality standards. Now, this was an attempt to solve some of the problems that we had with Honeycrisp, where some very substandard fruit comes to market. In this case, for example, with Sweet Tango or Rave, the marketer has to attempt to ensure that all the fruit sold meets some quality standards that are agreed to by the marketer and the university. And then also production volumes are managed so that overproduction does not occur. And also so that at least a minimum volume of production occurs in the beginning in order to get a good start for the variety. And this also, of course, provides a return to the University of Minnesota for its investment. There is a royalty for each tree planted. And then there's also what's called a fruit production royalty, or an annual subscription fee paid to the university for trademark use as the fruit is sold under that trademark. And this kind of plan has been used starting with Sweet Tango in the United States, and Honey Crunch in other countries. And then most recently with the new variety Min 55, which is sold under 2 trademarks, Rave nationally, and then First Kiss for Minnesota produced apples. And this brings us to the next topic, which is that most varieties have at least 2 names now. There's what we call the variety name and the generic name that's used as a patent and used in all the legal proceedings. And this is something like, if you think about aspirin as a product, this is sort of the generic name for aspirin. So in the case of one of our recent varieties, Min 55 is the legal name for that variety that you'll find on the plant patent at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And then most varieties then also have trademark or brand names that are used to market it. So for example, on aspirin, we have the trademark Bayer and several others that are used to market aspirin. For the Min 55 apple, there are 2 trademarks that are used: Rave by a number of producers around the country, and First Kiss to designate Minnesota grown Min 55 fruit. So these trademarks are registered for use only with the fruit. That is, they have nothing to do with the tree itself. There can only be Min 55 trees, but there can be Rave or First Kiss fruit if they meet the quality specifications to be marketed under those brands. To give you some idea of how this whole process proceeds, I've developed timelines for the breeding and testing of the Min 55 variety, and then the commercialization of the Min 55 variety, to give you an idea of what a long-term process it is. So for example, with Min 55, the original cross was made between Honeycrisp and an Arkansas selection way back in 1997. And the first fruit were observed on a single seedling back in 2003. Then there were several years of grafting and testing in US orchards. And finally, in 2018, there was the first production in US orchards. So over a 20-year process to get from making the cross to actually getting some production. And it'll still be another 5 years before we actually have large amounts of production of Rave or First Kiss in our US orchards. Now the commercialization proceeds as we get towards the end of that breeding and testing period. In the case of this variety, in 2013, there was an application for a US plant patent, which was issued in 2016. And then the production rights were licensed to Stamilt for production in the US and North American fruit sales using the Rave brand in 2014. And then also in that year, those rights were licensed to Minnesota growers for fruit sales using the First Kiss brand. From 2013 to 19 then, the plant breeders' rights and trademarks were applied for in other countries, and production may follow in those countries as we get into the 2020s and 2030s here. In 2018, the first fruit sales in Minnesota under the First Kiss and Rave brands were achieved. And again, we'll probably see at least 5 years from 2018 before a substantial amount of fruit is available, either in the state of Minnesota or the US. It takes a long time, in other words, to go from that original crossing through to a fully commercialized variety, 1997 up through the 2020s. So it's a long process. So currently, we use 2 commercialization models for University of Minnesota apple varieties that have been introduced since 2005. We use the managed variety plan that I discussed for varieties that have a potential national or global production interest. And so this has been used for the Sweet Tango program with the Mini Iska variety, and with the Rave and First Kiss programs for the Min 55 variety. So basically 2 varieties so far have gone out under this managed program since 2005. We've used it for, we've still continued to use the open commercialization plan with varieties of regional interest. So for example, this is for the Minnewaska variety, which consumers might know as Zestar, the Wild Dung variety, which consumers might know as Snowsweet, and then a new variety available starting in 2022, known by its selection number currently, although it will have a trademark name associated with it, the Min 1980 variety. So we still use the open variety release for some varieties with regional interest. I hope you've learned a little more about variety commercialization for University of Minnesota varieties, and please go ahead and enjoy the good fruits of our labor. Thank you.